You know, we've all been there, haven't we? Those conversations where you kind of nod along, but inside you're like, hold on, what did they just say?
It happens to the best of us.
It can be super awkward, especially when English isn't your first language. But you know what's interesting? It's not just about how well you know the language.
Right, it goes deeper than that.
It's like about the whole, psychology of how we talk to each other.
It really is. Even native speakers, I mean, we trip over our words, misunderstand things. It happens all the time.
Exactly. And this deep dive we're doing on making English conversations smoother, it has all these cool strategies that can help anyone, really, feel more comfortable when they're chatting, no matter what the situation is.
I think everyone can benefit from that for sure.
Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first things that jumped out at me from the source material is how important it is to ask for clarification.
That's a big one
I think so many people, myself included, we hesitate to do that.
because we don't want to seem like we don't get it.
Yeah, like we're afraid of looking clueless. Totally. But the material we're looking at, it actually says that's kind of backwards.
Interesting. How so?
Well, it's like that fear of seeming incompetent, it can actually stop us from truly understanding.
Ah, I see. Because if you don't ask, you might just miss the point entirely.
Exactly. You end up more lost because you were too afraid to speak up. So, how do we get over that? The source mentions some specific phrases we can use.
Yeah, those can be really helpful. Sometimes just having the right words makes it easier to ask.
Totally.
What I found interesting is that they highlight starting with "I'm sorry." It seems so simple, but it can make a big difference.
Like, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Exactly. Could you say it again? It softens the request.
Oh, that's smart. It's like you're not accusing them of not being clear.
Yeah, you're kind of disarming them with politeness.
Yeah.
It makes the other person more open to explaining.
I've also noticed sometimes it's not the whole sentence I miss, it's like one word or a phrase that throws me off.
Oh, absolutely.
In those cases, what do you suggest?
The source material, it recommends just being direct. Say something like, what does that word or phrase mean?
That's a good one. Simple and straight to the point.
It shows you're listening, that you're really trying to follow along.
And wanting to learn.
Exactly. It can even spark a more interesting conversation, digging deeper into the topic.
There's that story in the source about a student who was super embarrassed to ask for clarification at first, but then after she tried it a few times,
What happened?
she realized people were totally happy to explain things.
It's funny. We often assume others will be annoyed, but most people are actually happy to help.
And she said it made her seem more engaged in the conversation, like she was really interested.
It's a win-win.
It is. It reminds us that good communication, it goes both ways. You have to be willing to ask for help when you need it.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so asking for clarification, that's like communication 101. What else does the source material suggest for smoothing out those little bumps we hit when we're talking?
Rephrasing. We all do it to some extent, but the source breaks it down as a deliberate technique.
Oh yeah, rephrasing. I do that all the time. Especially when I can tell I'm not explaining something well.
We've all been there.
It's like hitting the reset button mid-sentence.
I love that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the pressure off. You don't have to find the perfect words on the first try. The source actually gives some phrases to use when you want to rephrase something.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so you could say, let me try to say that another way. Or, what I mean is, ooh, something like that.
Those are great. Especially, like, what I mean is, ooh, it helps you get to the heart of what you're trying to say. Have you ever noticed how some people just freeze up when they can't find the right words?
Oh, all the time. It's
Yeah.
like that they get stuck in their own heads.
The source material actually talks about that.
Does it?
Yeah, and it tells a story about someone who used to have that problem, getting all tongue-tied, but then they started practicing rephrasing even when they were alone, and it helped them get more comfortable with, being flexible with their words.
That's so interesting. So they were basically training their brain to find different ways of expressing the same idea.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off needing to be perfectly eloquent all the time.
That's a good point. We don't always have to be Shakespeare.
Right. We're allowed to stumble a bit.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that practice really does help. Even just thinking about those phrases can make a difference.
Absolutely. And by practicing rephrasing, we can avoid those awkward silences that sometimes pop up in conversations, which actually leads perfectly into the next point.
Oh, you're good at this. What's the next secret weapon for better conversations?
Transitional phrases. They're like the glue that holds the whole conversation together.
Okay, I like that analogy. They're like bridges between different parts of the conversation.
Exactly. They make everything flow smoothly from one point to the next.
Give me some examples. I need to add these to my toolbox.
All right, so let's say you want to show that you agree or that you're interested.
Okay, yeah.
Simple phrases like, "That's interesting," or "I see what you mean," those can go a long way.
Yeah, they're like little nods of encouragement, keeping the conversation going.
Precisely. And what if you want to know more about something? Like someone says something that piques your curiosity.
Oh, I do this all the time.
Me too. In those cases, the source suggests phrases like, "Can you tell me more about that?" Or "What happened next?"
Hmm.
Inviting the other person to expand on what they're saying.
Oh, I like those. It shows you're not just passively listening, you're really trying to understand.
Exactly. It's all about engagement. Now, what about those times when you want to change the subject, but you don't want to be rude or abrupt about it?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I always feel awkward doing that.
The source recommends using a phrase that links back to something they said earlier,
Yeah.
to make a smoother transition.
So you're not just jumping to a random new topic.
Right. So you could say something like, "Speaking of something they mentioned, have you ever?"
Ah, that's clever.
It makes the shift feel more natural.
Okay, I'm loving all these tips. These little phrases, they really can change the whole feel of a conversation.
Mhm.
There's that story in the source about a student who, well, they used to get stuck with those awkward silences.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
But then just by starting to use some of these basic transitional phrases like, "That's cool," or "really,"
Hmm.
they were able to overcome that and feel so much more confident when they were talking to people.
It's amazing how such small changes can have such a big impact.
It really is. But
That's
ultimately, it all comes down to putting these techniques into practice in real conversations. The source emphasizes how important that is, especially in situations where you feel comfortable, low pressure environments.
absolutely. You need a conversational safe space.
I love that, like a training ground for your communication skills.
Exactly. It could be with friends, family, or even online, like in those language exchange groups that the source mentions.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Starting in those environments where you feel safe, it lets you build up your confidence before you try using these techniques in more challenging situations.
It's like anything else. The more you practice, the better you get.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that fear of appearing incompetent, which ironically can hold us back from actually getting better at communicating.
So true. It's like a vicious cycle, but we can break it.
We can. Find your safe space, practice these techniques, and watch your confidence grow.
This has been so insightful. We've talked about asking for clarification, rephrasing, using transitional phrases. What's a final piece of the puzzle for mastering smooth English conversations?
It all comes down to practice. It's the key to making all these techniques we've been talking about feel natural.
I get that, but practice can sound kind of scary. Brings back memories of those boring language drills in school.
I know what you mean.
But the source we're looking at, it seems to be suggesting a more organic way of practicing.
Right. It's not about drilling yourself. It's more about finding ways to use these techniques in your everyday life.
So instead of setting aside time for practice, it's more about being aware of how we're communicating all the time.
Exactly. Weaving those techniques into your regular conversations.
Okay, I like that. Can you give me some examples, like specific scenarios where we can try this out?
Absolutely. Imagine you're talking to a coworker about a project and they mention something you don't fully understand.
Happens all the time.
Instead of just nodding along, you could say, "Can you tell me more about that?"
Right, so you're not pretending you get it when you don't.
And it shows you're really engaged.
It's like a subtle way of saying, hey, I want to be on the same page as you.
Exactly. Or let's say you're catching up with a friend, they're telling a story, and they use some slang that you're not familiar with.
Oh yeah, I hate when that happens.
That's the perfect time to use a clarification phrase. You could say, "I'm sorry, could you explain what that slang word means?"
And they probably won't even realize you're practicing a language technique.
Exactly.
Hmm?
We're just showing interest in what they're saying.
Mhm.
And remember, even those little phrases like, "That's interesting," or "really," they can make a difference.
They do. It shows you're listening and following along.
They're like little verbal cues that keep the conversation flowing. Now, if you're feeling brave, you could even try some rephrasing in those casual settings.
Oh, okay. Give me an example.
So your friend is telling that story. You want to make sure you understand it right. You can say, "So what you're saying is," and then summarize what you've heard.
Ah, that's a good one. It shows you're paying attention, and it gives them a chance to correct you if you've got it wrong.
Exactly. It's a win-win for clear communication.
What I find really cool about this approach is it's not just about getting better at English, it's about developing communication skills that work in any language.
You're so right. active listening, clear communication, being able to adapt and rephrase, those are skills you need no matter what language you're speaking.
Whether it's English, Swahili, sign language, doesn't matter.
Exactly. And the more you practice these things, the more natural they become. Like you're building muscle memory for good communication.
I like that. Muscle memory for conversations. The source specifically talks about language exchange groups as a great place to practice. Why are those so beneficial?
Well, they create this environment where everyone is there to practice their language skills.
Mm,
You're all in the same boat, so there's less pressure to be perfect.
right, you're all learning together.
Exactly. It
Right.
takes away that fear of making mistakes, which is so important when you're trying to get better at something.
It's like a judgment-free zone for language learning.
That's a great way to put it. The source tells this story about a student who joined one of these groups, and they found it so helpful. Just having that supportive community made them feel more confident.
And these days, with all the online platforms, it's easier than ever to find these kinds of groups, even if you don't live in a big city with language schools everywhere.
That's true.
Yeah.
There's so many virtual language exchange groups, apps, websites, all kinds of things.
It's about finding what works for you, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Creating that learning environment where you feel comfortable.
And remembering that everyone learns differently. Some people might prefer practicing one-on-one with a friend or a tutor before they jump into a group setting.
Of course.
Mhm.
There's no right or wrong way to do it. The important thing is to find what works for you and not compare yourself to others.
Celebrate those little victories along the way.
Exactly. The source also makes a really important point. It's okay to stumble, to make mistakes, to not always find the perfect words.
It's all part of the process.
It is. It's a good reminder that we don't have to be perfect communicators. We just have to be effective ones.
Right. We're allowed to be human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the specific phrases and techniques that the source suggests. Are you ready to break down some of these tools and see how they work in practice?
Let's do it. I'm all ears.
Great. Let's start with asking for clarification. It's such a fundamental skill because it makes sure everyone's on the same page.
It prevents those misunderstandings that can happen so easily.
Exactly. One of the phrases that stood out to me from the source was, could you explain that in another way?
Hmm.
It's polite, it's straightforward, and it shows you're genuinely interested in understanding.
It's like, hey, I'm trying, but this isn't clicking for me yet.
And without blaming the speaker. It's not saying they did a bad job explaining, it's just saying, I need a different approach.
I like that. It puts the focus on finding a way to understand, not on pointing fingers.
Right, it's collaborative. Another good phrase is, what does that word or phrase mean?
Hmm.
This one's super helpful when you come across vocabulary you don't know.
It's so clear and direct. You're
Yeah.
giving the speaker a very specific target for their explanation.
Exactly. And remember, the source emphasizes this. Native English speakers ask for clarification all the time.
It's not just for people learning English.
It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of active listening. It shows you're paying attention and you want to understand.
So if someone uses an idiom you don't know, don't be afraid to ask.
Exactly. For example, if someone says, let's touch base next week,
I wouldn't know what that meant.
you could simply ask, what does touch base mean?
And then they'll explain it means to have a quick chat or meeting.
Exactly. No big deal.
All right, asking for clarification check. Now, let's talk about rephrasing. This is where those phrases like, let me say that another way, or what I mean is, come in handy.
They're like lifesavers for those moments when your words get all tangled up.
They give you permission to pause, take a breath, and try again. The source makes a good point about how using those phrases can actually take the pressure off speaking perfectly, because you're acknowledging that it's okay to make mistakes.
You're basically saying, I'm human, I'm allowed to mess up.
And I love that the source calls it hitting the reset button mid-sentence. It's like, oops, let me try that again.
Communication is a process, not a performance. We're allowed to stumble along the way. Remember that story the source shared about the person who used to freeze up during conversations because they were so worried about finding the perfect words?
Oh yeah, they were so focused on being eloquent that they get completely stuck.
But practicing rephrasing helped them overcome that fear. They learned to embrace the fact that conversations are messy, they're unpredictable, and that's okay.
It's not about being perfect, it's about getting your message across.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to do that is to just admit you need to rephrase something and try again. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Asking for clarification and rephrasing, those are two essential tools for navigating those tricky moments in English conversations. And the key, as we've been saying, is practice.
Practice, practice, practice.
Find those opportunities in your everyday life, try out these techniques, see what works for you.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Every stumble is a chance to learn.
And the more you use these techniques, the more natural they'll become.
Remember, the goal isn't to speak perfect English. It's to communicate effectively, to connect with people. Now, I'm really excited to move on to transitional phrases. These are the phrases that can make a conversation flow so smoothly.
They're like the secret ingredient for a really great conversation.
Shall we explore them?
Let's dive in.
I'm all ears. All right, transitional phrases. They can seem kind of small, but this source material we've been looking at, it really emphasizes how important they are for making conversations flow better.
They're like, what's the word? They're like the verbal equivalent of a good dance partner.
Okay, I like that.
They help you move through the conversation gracefully without stepping on anyone's toes.
I love that analogy. They're like little cues, right? They keep the energy up and they stop things from getting awkward. So let's break it down. What are some of your favorite transitional phrases to use, like for different situations?
Well, for agreeing or showing interest, even a simple, "that's interesting," can be really effective.
Yeah, it's like a little acknowledgement.
Exactly. It shows you're listening, and it encourages them to keep talking.
I find myself saying, I see what you mean a lot.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's a way of acknowledging their perspective, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying.
It keeps the door open for more discussion.
Exactly. And what about those times when you want to learn more about something? Like someone mentions something that really piques your curiosity.
Oh, definitely. Phrases like, "can you tell me more about that?" or "what happened next?" are perfect for those moments.
Because it shows you're genuinely interested, right? Not just asking questions for the sake of it.
Exactly. It's like you're inviting them to share more, to expand on their thoughts.
It makes it more of a conversation, less of an interview.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, changing the subject, that can be tricky. Sometimes you need to steer the conversation in a different direction, but you don't want to be abrupt about it.
Oh, yeah. It can feel really awkward to just suddenly switch topics.
It can. But the source material has some good advice for this.
Oh, tell me, tell me.
One strategy is to link back to something they said earlier. Use that as a springboard to introduce the new topic.
So it doesn't feel so random.
Right, so you could say something like, "speaking of something they mentioned, have you ever..."
Oh, that's smart. It makes the transition feel more natural.
And even those simple responses, "that's cool," or "really," they play a role too.
They do. They're little signs that you're engaged, that you're following along.
And they help avoid those awkward silences.
Remember that story about the student who used to struggle with those silences? Just by adding a few of those phrases, their whole conversational experience changed.
It's amazing how small changes can make such a difference.
It really is. And what's fascinating to me is, all these things we've been talking about, active listening, smooth transitions, engaging with the other person, those aren't just for English conversations.
That's such a good point. Those are principles that can apply to any language.
It makes you wonder, are there universal elements of good communication that go beyond words? Things that transcend language barriers?
It's something to think about for sure. Maybe that's a deep dive for another day.
So whether you're chatting with friends, colleagues, or even strangers, incorporating these techniques can make those interactions smoother, more enjoyable, and ultimately more meaningful. It's about building those connections, fostering genuine understanding.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And remember, the source encourages us to practice these techniques in those low-pressure environments, those safe spaces we were talking about.
The more we experiment with these phrases and strategies, the more natural they'll become.
Absolutely. And don't forget to have fun with it. Language is a powerful tool, and the more we embrace its nuances, the more we can unlock its full potential.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. We've covered so much ground today, exploring all these different ways to make our English conversations smoother, more engaging, and less awkward. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.